Hello, my name's Cliff Stevenson and I'm the Helpful Economist. Today I'm in front of the Bank of England and I'm going to tell you 10 things about UK inflation. So although we saw a fall in inflation in April, inflation isn't falling as quick as the government and Bank of England hoped. The yearly rate of inflation fell from in March at 10.1% to 8.7% in April. But that's still really high, 8.7. It was expected to be lower than that. What's really worrying is that the effect of energy prices is now out of the calculation, and food prices still increased by 19% in the year to April. And that means that a year ago, if you were spending £100 on your shopping in the supermarket, it's now costing £119. That's a massive increase. And most people's wages have not increased by anywhere near that amount. So pretty much the whole country is getting poorer. What's also really concerning is that the core rate of inflation, i.e. the rate of inflation taking out the impact of energy and food prices, is still high at 6.8%. There is an inflation problem at the moment and it's persisting, it's not going away quickly. Inflation measures the change in prices, how much prices have increased over the last year, and it's expressed in a percentage. So inflation coming down does not mean that prices are falling. If your basket of goods in the supermarket went up from £100 last year to £119 this year, it's still going to cost £119. In fact, inflation is definitely going to continue this year at significant levels, so it's going to go even more expensive. So it's important to remember what inflation is. So there's been some talk of greedflation, of whether business is profiteering from increased prices. In the case of the supermarkets, Sainsbury's and Tesco, for example, point out how their profits have actually fallen over the past year. And it is true that they've fallen somewhat, but not that significantly. And Sainsbury's is still making profits of almost £1 billion and Tesco £2.5 billion. These seem like very high numbers, but in fact, they're making about 3 to 4% profit on their turnover. And so they're not massive profits. At the same time, people are really struggling with inflation. And it is possible that supermarkets have kept prices higher than they needed to. Just because profits have fallen doesn't mean they've fallen by as much as they could have done. After all, this is a low margin business, and it wouldn't be surprising in difficult times if the supermarkets actually went into loss making. So you could argue that the supermarkets have ensured that they still make very substantial profits and that they've done that at the expense of consumers. I think there is a general point here about business, that we live in an economic system where companies are supposed to maximize profits, and when times are difficult for business and they have to lower prices and they make losses, generally they have to absorb those losses. So it's normal in the system that if there's an opportunity to make big profits, that companies take advantage of that. I'm not saying that's a good thing, that's the economic system that we live in, and I think that there are questions about that and about whether we could do things differently, but it seems a little bit rich to blame businesses for doing what their raison d'etre is. I was at a presentation once where there was a business person saying that they actually liked increased prices as long as everyone's facing the same increase. Because when you have a long period of stable prices, as we've had, it's much harder to make money. This was the argument they said. When prices are increasing, as long as everyone's facing the price increase, there's an opportunity to make money. And so whether you call it greedflation, profiteering, or just normal economic business in a free market system, I do think it's very likely that companies have increased prices quite significantly above what they needed to in terms of their own costs. So the government is actually doing very little about inflation, and the truth is that's because it can't. The Bank of England has responsibility for interest rates, which are the primary tool used to control inflation, and the Bank of England is independent, so the government can have no say or influence over what the interest rate is. That's set by the Bank of England, that the rate necessary to deal with inflation based on their assessments. The government's been talking about getting supermarkets to voluntarily hold down prices on certain basic food items, and this is something that the French government have been doing in response to inflation. It seems that nothing compulsory is going to be made about this scheme. In the end, I think the truth is the government can do very little, but it has to be seen, or it feels that it has to be seen to be doing something. But this is controversial amongst MPs because some MPs are saying this just isn't what governments do in a free market system. My own feeling is that there's a complacence and an arrogance in the government and in the Bank of England. When Sunak made the announcement earlier this year that he would halve inflation by the end of the year, I thought to myself, how's he going to do that? And he was banking on the fact that because of the energy price increase was going to fall out of the inflation calculation, that it would fall very significantly. But it's just not falling by as much as he expected at that time. Sunak's promise to halve inflation was really just going for low-hanging fruit that seemed like an obvious political win, but actually was totally meaningless in terms of what the government can do themselves. Inflation is persisting much longer than people expected. Officials from the Bank of England were giving some evidence to the Treasury Select Committee the other day, and they were being honest about how their economic models, which they use to forecast inflation and then make decisions about interest rates, they have flaws in them, and of course they do. No one can make a perfect economic model. After all, economic models are using data from history, from things that have happened. You can learn some things about the relationships between variables based on past data. That's definitely true. I see the value of statistics, but they can never definitively tell you what's going to happen going forwards. And I think that economic forecasts are dangerously seductive in terms of appearing to give nice, straightforward answers to questions for politicians that actually are much less reliable than we think. My own feeling is that inflation is going to persist. Inflation can go up very quickly, but I think there is a stickiness in inflation coming down. It's a little bit like you can put weight on very easily, but it's more difficult to use it. And I think the increases in inflation have been so significant that very significant stickiness has been triggered. So we're not going to see a big fall. It's going to come down slowly. And perhaps if there's one or two shocks later in the year, it's going to increase again, and we really just don't know. I hope for everyone's sake that it comes down and that the Bank of England is right, and their aim is within the next few years to have it back to 2%, but that does seem a little bit optimistic perhaps. Compared to other countries, it does seem like the UK is persistently high. France and Germany have significantly lower inflation, although it's not that much lower, and it's in the same ballpark. Inflation is still a problem in France and Germany, so it's not just a UK problem. But it's interesting to look at the US, where inflation is less than half of what it is in the UK. I think there are a possible couple of reasons why the UK has suffered a little bit worse. And I think here we have to mention Brexit. The LSE did a study showing that since 2019, around 1/3 of the increase in price of food was to do with trade barriers related to Brexit. The fact is, importing has become more expensive, more burdensome, and so there's been an impact of that on food prices. Another point is that the UK has turned itself into a relatively small market. It was part of a massive competitive single market, and it's now extracted itself from that, and there are new trade barriers, and that reduces the level of competition in the market. The US and the EU are much bigger markets and perhaps have much more vigorous price competition, so part of the inflation effect may be to do with this slightly reduced competition in the UK market. When Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, he froze the taxation thresholds, and Jeremy Hunt extended this. So the tax thresholds remain frozen at the moment. So inflation is actually having a big impact on the amount of tax collected, because wages have been going up in response to inflation, but the tax thresholds haven't been going up. And so what this means is that actually 3.2 million new people will be brought into tax, and 2.1 million new people will be taken into the 40% tax rate. This will increase taxes by £29 billion. And it's effectively a tax increase of 4%. Now, I personally believe that our current economic problems require more tax to be paid. I'm not a supporter of austerity, but I think that governments need to be honest about taxes. The Conservatives portray themselves as a low tax party, yet 4% is actually a very significant tax increase, and it's done by stealth. People don't even know about it. So I think there needs to be some honesty about this, because it's just ordinary people that are going to be paying more taxes. This actually doesn't affect the most wealthy people at all. Official statistics show that people on a low income are effectively facing inflation of 10.1%, while people on high incomes are facing inflation of 8.7%. And the reason for this is that we've seen massive increases in basic prices like food and energy. Those items constitute a higher proportion of total budget of those on a low income than those on a high income. So in fact, they're paying a higher tax rate. What's going on? We're taxing the poor more than the rich. The impact of this is seen by the charities working to provide food banks. The Trussell Trust, which has a network of food banks, says that there's been a record increase in the amount of food parcels that it's been giving out, and that this has actually reached almost 3 million. And really sad is that more than 1 million of these food parcels are for children. Is this really the kind of society we want to be living in? Most people support the global policies to deal with the environmental crisis, but I think there's an impact on inflation of these more stringent environmental policies that people just don't realise. And that is that if you require companies to improve their environmental practices and harm the environment less, that actually increases their costs, and therefore prices are going to increase. And so as we see more and more progress on the introduction of environmental practices to deal with the climate crisis, this is going to cause more inflation. And I think people just don't realise that. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. In fact, I think we absolutely need to do it. But what we do need to do is to be ready for the fact that it's going to cost more. Things are going to cost more. Ideally, countries like China that are currently operating with relatively low environmental and even social regulations, treatment of labour, for example, that hopefully they'll improve their practices, but that means their costs are going to increase. So one reason why we've had really low inflation for many years is because we've imported from countries that have very low environmental and social standards. And of course the products are cheap, and that's helped keep inflation down. But as we have to deal with these environmental and social issues going forwards, we're just going to have to accept that that's going to cost more. Maybe as a planet we need to consume less. It's right that the price of products increases in order to fully capture any environmental costs that are incurred in the production of the products. But that is going to mean higher inflation. I hope you found this information useful. My name's Cliff Stevenson. I'm the Helpful Economist. See you next time.